Hello, this is the last of my four-part presentation on the U.S. debt crisis. My name is Pat Obi. I'm a professor of finance at Purdue University, Calumet. In this final part, I discuss the path to debt elimination. And I'm proposing a two-step process. The first is to set a maximum debt goal. And by this I mean to determine a debt to GDP ratio that is coincident with a period of normal growth experienced in the United States. For example, I find that for the most part, since well after the end of the Second World War, 1953 until present, that the average GDP growth in the US is about 6%. A little bit more closely, I find that if I take a random sample of a long-term period, say for example from 1980 to 2007, I find the 6% to still hold. Now, I have carefully avoided the period after 2007 because of the turbulence associated with the housing crisis and the ensuing global financial crisis. Now, though, I also find that during this period where the economy grew at an average of 6% per year, that the debt to GDP ratio hardly exceeded approximately 57%. So I kind of rounded it up to 60%. So I'm determining here that the maximum debt to GDP ratio that is coincident with this normal growth period during which we experienced an average annual growth of 6% is about 60%. Therefore, for us to set a debt ceiling that is in line with normal economic growth, we should strive to a goal of no more than 60%. And so here, for example, I show that based on 2010 GDP of $14.5 trillion, that our target debt level should be $8.7 trillion, which is 60% of 14.5. However, you find that the 2010 debt level was 14.025 trillion, giving us excess debt of $5.3 trillion. So this would be considered excess debt. In any event, this has having been determined, the next step would be to set spending and revenue levels that match this debt to GDP target. So to kind of explain how this works, all right, currently under scenario 1, which I place here, under the U.S. Budget Control Act of 2011, passed on August 2nd, 2011, Congress passed a law and President Obama signed it, proposing, actually requiring a $1 trillion spending cut over 10 years. Now, I show here that this is nothing, and of course, the market figured that out, and that's why Standard & Poor's on August 5th downgraded U.S. credit rating because it wasn't impressed by this. And I show here that giving a fairly conservative growth estimate for the country's revenues, 3%, and an adjusted spending level, which is shown here over the next 10 years. And this spending level takes into account approximately 7.4% growth in medical costs and a few other issues associated with cuts in military spending, discretionary spending, and perhaps also social security spending. So actually I factored in quite a great deal here, subject to these constraints I mentioned at the bottom right here. So based on that, I show a deficit surplus, which is basically the difference between these two columns. Now I also show, based on this estimate, what the national debt level is expected to be going forward, based on all of these, which would be the level of debt we currently have, and added to then these deficits and surpluses, if we have any, added to those. So in any event, you see that still the national debt level continues to rise to almost $24 trillion 10 years from today. But also we find that if our GDP grows at the normal rate of 6%, we can experience on average our GDP to be almost $26 trillion. But that's not the point. The point is how much debt do we have here as a percent of the GDP. And you can see that it actually rises quite a bit, into the intermediate term future before it starts to inch down, and even so very marginally. So this $1 trillion spending cut, it ain't gonna cut it. No pun intended. In scenario 2, I consider the additional provision in that law which says that if the super committee doesn't come up with additional $1.5 trillion in cut, that there's going to be an additional, therefore, $1.2 trillion in automatic spending cut, which would include domestic spending as well as military spending. So the total cut here would be 1 plus 1.2, which is 2.2. So again, with that in view, I readjusted the total adjusted spending here, and I show here that in the later instars of our deficit surplus regime here, we'll probably start picking up a few pennies. Nevertheless, observe how our national debt rises until, well into the 10th period, when it starts to ebb a little bit. Now, again, given the projected growth in GDP, we find that the debt to GDP ratio, again, would rise quite a bit into the intermediate term, and it doesn't really show any significant signs of improvement until around the 8th to the 10th period. And so, again, this is a level which is well above the 60% debt to GDP ratio target that I'm proposing here, and which would be more coincident with the normal economic growth in the US. Finally, here is my proposal, which actually goes with a recommendation that was brought forth much earlier before Congress kind of decided that they weren't going to go along with it. But this includes the $3 trillion in spending cuts, as well as $1 trillion in revenue increase, basically tax revenue increase, for a total of $4 trillion. The reason that this has the most promise is because it drastically attacks the debt level. And so here I show projections in revenue, normal revenue, projections in spending going forward. But importantly, I show here that when you look at the debt to GDP ratio, you find that it's only in the short term that the ratio kind of goes up. And then shortly thereafter, it systematically drops, such that by the 10th period, we find that actually there is a greater likelihood that we're going to be approximating the debt to GDP ratio goal of 60%. So to kind of show this in a visual, I put up this picture right here, and as you can see, for all the three scenarios shown, this is the first one, which is based on the current law, which really does nothing. The red bars show the national debt level as a percent of the GDP, and as you can see, it continues to rise. The second one a little bit. The third one shows the greatest promise. So that's my recommendation, and I hope that you understand it. My conclusion here is that first, we seek to set a target debt level, and secondly, that we seek to align our spending and revenue in line with the target debt level, and that should be, in my opinion, the most promising approach to resolving the current debt crisis. Hope you enjoyed it. My name is Pat Obi, Professor of Finance at Purdue University, Calumet in the United States. Goodbye.